Hello, Encounter. Thank you for joining us today. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Joel. I'm the lead pastor at Encounter, and we're really glad that you are with us worshiping online. We are at the very end of a series around the issues of racial justice called Race, Justice, and Peace. And, we've been into this for many weeks, and God's been speaking lots of things to us, and I think it's been great so far. And today, to close us off, I've invited a friend of mine named Scott Ancarrow. Scott is the lead pastor of the Foundry Church in Baltimore. And when I was kind of like getting ready to start Encounter, he was my coach. So I would, talk to him, every week and just kind of like bounce off ideas and, things I was going through. And, he was very, very helpful to a life of church at this time. But beyond that, Scott is somebody I admire a lot. And I admire his style of leadership. I admire, the church that God's allowed him to plant and lead in Baltimore. I often tell him this to his face. If there was a church that I would like for us to look like, that's not like one of those big famous mega churches, it would be his church. Like, I really, really love the Foundry, what the Foundry is about, what the Foundry stands for. And I'm so honored that Scott would, join us today to close this series. The reason why I asked Scott to preach is because, Scott leads a church that, it might be a little bit larger than us, but like at least in makeup is very similar to Encounter. And Scott was pastoring at the Foundry already when, the protest about the death of Freddie Gray happened in Baltimore. And he was there when Baltimore was the center of national attention because of what was going on. And he was there when the cameras left and when nobody cared about Baltimore and wasn't putting Baltimore on the news. And he's been faithful, leading that church and committed to a work of justice in that place. And, today what we're going to do is kind of like talk about this idea of, what does it look to be the church in this conversation? What does it mean to work for justice and peace around the issues of racial inequality as a church? And there's no way I can think that's better equipped to share with us this conversation. So I hope you guys enjoy hearing from Scott.
It was several years ago that I left the United States for the very first time, went with my church across the U.S. border into Mexico. And it was there that we partnered with an organization that was equipping churches for mission in their community, helping build houses for folks in need. And it was a construction project. But if I'm real about what was going on in me, was this deconstruction and this reconstruction of sorts. It was the first time I had ever left my kind of suburban kind of sensibilities. It was the first time I had ever confronted some of the idolatries that exist behind our American ideologies. And all week long, through prayer times and through times of serving and processing in this group of people, I was feeling a sense of disruption, that God was stirring something that needed to change more than just in the community in which I was serving. And so as we get back in the car to go back across the border into the United States, we're all talking a good game, right? About all the things that are going to change because of the experience we just had. We thought this was so formative to us. And what we underestimated and we didn't think through was how quickly the pressures of turning our cell phones back on and the comforts of a shower and a cheeseburger and the distractions of Comic-Con going on in San Diego while a new Harry Potter book came out, what those things would do to take a disruption and really just kind of leave it to a place of interruption. But before long, the experience and the work that we had done, that God had done in us in Mexico, became this like piece of information kind of stored back in the back of my brain for the next time I wanted to get into an argument or win a conversation or just go have an experience that was transformative again. I made the mistake of mistaking a time where God was trying to bring disruption and let it just be an interruption. This series and the time that we've spent together these past few weeks in Encounter have come at a time where we have experienced a great disruption, where we've slowed down enough to realize something that a lot of you knew all along, which was that all of the injustices in our country weren't just something that happened in the past. that we didn't cure racism in 1968, that the work of justice is a long and slow and disruptive work. And as we slowed down here in COVID, or the world slowed down for us, we were exposed to things that maybe in other circumstances we just were blind to. Or maybe for the very first time, we've been at this work for a while, and we've started to see people who have never really thought about this stuff before begin to talk to us and engage with us about the things that they can do. This series is aimed to equip and challenge you as a church to think about the individual and interpersonal and institutional layers in which the work of justice and reconciliation and fighting against the sin of racism are not just peripheral pieces of information for the church. They are the work of mission and bringing the gospel to bear in our moment. And we have to caution ourselves against, in this moment, as this series comes to an end, for putting these things in the back of our brain as a good piece of trivia, and then putting them, into the next time that we just want to win an argument on Facebook, or getting choked out by the realities of trying to get our kids back on for online school, or the pressures of your job that have now amplified as things begin to reopen, or even just the distraction of your defending champions taking the field again to play baseball. How do we do this work over the course of the long haul? That it's not just good trivia, that it's not just an interruption, but it's a disruption of the ways in which we were doing things before, that we would not just go back to normal. This is something I know a little bit of something about as a church planter in Baltimore. I moved to this city in 2013. We moved downtown, our family did, because we wanted to see a thriving, flourishing city. We wanted to see how our church could be part of the shalom of the city, the flourishing of the city, to bring spiritual, relational, economic, just flourishing to the city of Baltimore. And as we moved in with a pretty good awareness of the present tense struggles of our city. We moved in with a pretty decent, at least secondhand experience and knowledge of the past hurts of the city that shaped Baltimore in terms of redlining and deindustrialization. But if I'm honest, I kind of thought that we could come in and the good intentions and the right information could help us create a brand new future. And in 7 years of being a church planter in Baltimore City, I have experienced the reality that it is not enough to rely on good information and one good sermon series on race and the pursuit of justice to really do the long haul work that Christ is calling us to do, calling the church to do, not as, sort of plan B or C or D, but as plan A in the work of seeing the hope of Jesus brought to bear in our community. So the question I want to ask for us today is, how do we do this well? And how do we do all these things we've learned together over these past few weeks for the long haul? Galatians 6:9 says it this way. Paul says, "Let us not become weary in doing good. For at the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." And I think the question for us today is how do we not give up when we experience the reality that this is going to be a harder, longer, perhaps more heartbreaking work with peaks and valleys. And so here's what I want to do in our time together. I want to take a few minutes and unpack different layers of this verse and kind of make a statement about how we do justice and good over the course of the long haul. And along the way, I'll kind of pepper in some just ways that which we've seen that play out, specifically in my context, Baltimore City, which is a city where, you probably are familiar with some of the challenges of our city. It's a pretty common city for people to talk about, but not really want to talk to. And so I'm talking to you as someone who's trying to do this work of justice and reconciliation in our community over the course of the long haul. And I'll start here. I think the first thing this verse points to, and it matches a reality I've lived out and experienced, is that if we want to do this work over the long haul, we have to start with our own hearts. before we run outward and begin to do, and before we get so focused on doing, doing is preceded by being, who we are, and going inward and letting the picture of good that's inferred in this text be shaped not by our cultural pictures of good, but by God's picture of good, by that absolute truth that exists in the world, by the pictures of justice and flourishing that you've talked about in this series, that don't just come from our platitudes and sentimental pictures of those words, but from God's mission and God's heart for everyone made in God's image. You know, we have the propensity to tend to think that we're always the good guys, right? When you're driving on the highway and you're speeding, it's because you've got someplace to be and you're so in control. But when everyone else is speeding, they're a maniac. Can you believe them, right? We tend to think charitably about ourselves and think, not charitably about everyone else. But here's the reality. You are a sinner. I am a sinner. Very few people deny that. But what we do tend to deny is how our pictures of good and justice and love and peace are corrupted by being sinful, right? That we choose selfish things, that as selfish people, we can create selfish systems, and that as those selfish systems perpetuate themselves over time, it becomes the water you drink and the air that you breathe. And unless you're marginalized by those systems, you may not even see them. So when other people are like, hey, picture of good being disrupted, you're like, well, not for me. I'm doing just fine. But Paul says, let's not get weary at doing good, which means not just your picture of good or my picture of good, but God's picture of good, that's redeemed by the work of the gospel. And so we've got to start with our own hearts, right? Because we all fancy ourselves as the person that would have sheltered Anne Frank, that would have walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with John Lewis, that would have hailed and celebrated the speeches that Frederick Douglass gave. But the reality is, probably more than we even think, that our pictures of comfort and complacency might corrupt our pictures of good in the moments that those things emerge, even more so than we realize. And so we've got to go inward as we go outward. Proverbs 4 says, guard your heart. It's the wellspring of life. In other words, when the water source is poisoned by sin, its implications to everything it touches will be toxic. And we have to go inward and let the gospel speak to our pictures of justice and goodness and righteousness and to see those things prevail, right? And one of the things I think I underestimated was how much in Baltimore the need to steward my own picture of justice would be. In 2015, you might remember that a young man died in police custody, and the protesting was peaceful for several days, but as that this esteem gained and it became a story of national interest and people came into the city, things reached a boiling point, and out of that came unrest and kind of an uprising of sorts. And to live in Baltimore City and to be in that moment and to want to see justice prevail meant that I had to confront a lot of conflicting emotions, compassion and hurt for everyone that had been involved in the death of Freddie Gray. Like to a family, to feel the sting of what it might be like to be a neighbor or a friend, but then also to see in my own city, my love for the city, just challenged by the grief that I was feeling, and then to feel the anger, not just at the injustice that had been perpetuated to Freddie Gray, but to see the anger at the failure of elected officials, the anger at those who had come into the city to sort of pilfer and prostitute the pain of our city to kind of line their own narratives. I was unprepared for how long and hard this work would be, that my weariness could turn into bitterness. And in general, what do they say about decisions after midnight, right? Like when we're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, it's not a good place for us to operate well, right? That our pictures of love, that our pictures of justice, that our pictures of good can be disrupted by our feelings. And so it's so important to go inward, to process the pain that we might feel in this moment, to process the anger that we might feel in the moments of working injustice, right? Some of us are frustrated because you've been banging this drum for years now, and suddenly people are coming to the party because they slowed down enough during a pandemic to pay attention. And what the gospel does is help us go inward in a way that stewards that anger and that frustration in a righteous way. There are others of us who have been called cultural Marxists for the very first time because we had the audacity to say that someone's life matters. And the betrayal and the loneliness and the isolation as you watch your Facebook wall get blown up by everyone that was part of a city that you used to live in. Like, that's real. And so it's a reminder for us to go inward, to rest in the shelter of God's wings as we aim to do this work of justice. So that we don't suffer from compassion fatigue, which is why I think the church is uniquely positioned to do the work of justice and reconciliation in a way that government can't, in the way that other institutions in your city cannot. The Church of Jesus Christ is uniquely positioned to do this work in the short term and for the long haul. And the gospel living and dwelling and refining and teaching and forgiving and shaping us is a way that we get there. Number 2, we look for the helpers, right? So if we start with our own heart, number 1. Number 2, we begin to look for the helpers. Let me go back to the text. It says, let us not become weary at doing good. Us. So usually we read scripture in the West, in America, with a very individualistic eye. You know, if I was sitting in front of a screen right now, my first filter of interpretation would be to go, okay, as Scott Ancarrow, how do I begin to not grow weary in doing what is good? But the implications of the text are communal. Us. Let us not grow weary. So this is less of a Liam Neeson, you're the superhero, you got to go be the justice working Iron Man. And this is more of how do you see yourself as a bigger part of God's story working in your city. When you moved to the city, you didn't bring God's presence and justice with you. It was there before you got there. Your role now, as you live in your context, as you live in your space, is to slow down and to pay attention and to go inward and begin to say, God, where are we seeing works of justice and justice workers and kingdom workers emerge so that we might work together to bring flourishing to our city? One of the pieces that God deconstructs in the Old Testament with Elijah is the idea that he's like some kind of lone ranger, right? Part of his depression in 1 Kings 19 has to do with the fact that he's siphoned himself off to a place where he feels alone, and God reminds him that there's a multitude. And there's a multitude somewhere in your city, maybe in your church, also beyond your church. There are folks that have been doing the work of justice in your community, doing the work of good in your community long before you pulled up for that internship. And in this moment, if you're discouraged and you're frustrated and you don't know where to start, you begin to go outward after going inward and saying, how can I be on board with what God is doing in our church, with what God is doing in our community? Let me speak about Baltimore for a minute. Because here's what I noticed early on. When we moved here, we came in and we had lots of good ideas about things we wanted to do and ways we wanted to serve, and we would throw those things out to people and be just a little bit offended that they weren't immediately, instantaneously ready to run with us. The reality was they had been promised a whole lot of things along the way by well-intentioned people that did not have a long view and had not been part of the community doing the work of good in that context. And what they were inviting me to do and us to do as a church was to sit down and to slow down and to be part of the work so that we could be effective for the long haul. I took it as a threat. Why don't you care about the work we want to do? Why aren't you buying into the vision that we have, as if a slick marketing campaign is all that it would take to do the work of justice? I saw this personally in 2015 and felt it personally when I watched mainstream media come into our city, when I watched all kinds of organizations come into the city and kind of prop themselves up as the solution to all of Baltimore's ills. And then, when it wasn't a national story, pull out and go away. And I felt that pain. And I felt that sense of abandonment. And I understood that surliness that I had experienced for the first time. This work is too important for us to see ourselves as like the only answer, right? That rather what we do right now is we understand that there's no shortage of people who are trying to use crisis to prop their own platform. But letting us not grow weary at doing good is to find people right now, if you're discouraged, that can speak courage into your story to go out and to do the work. And if you are a person who's ready to go, to maybe go and to find the places and the spaces where the work of justice is being done in your community, and to get behind and breathe courage into those things. And so it looked a lot less for us like creating 50 new programs in Baltimore that we couldn't sustain for the first 6 months after the unrest. What it meant instead was getting behind people of peace who had been doing the work of justice with our time and talents and treasures as individuals and as a church. It meant getting behind Jeff, who lived in a particular community and was always the guy who was doing good things for young people in the community, but suddenly had an opportunity to create a sports league that would engage those who had been left behind by some of the systems and structures prior to that time. It meant working alongside my friends Holly and Kanika, who had been doing a job development training for at-risk youth in their community and suddenly needed a whole swell of resources for new people who were interested. It meant getting behind my friend Wendell, who had moved to Baltimore shortly after the unrest to help young men process the trauma that they had experienced, and to, rather than create a brand new mentoring program from scratch, to get behind the work that he was doing so that we might create a further, deeper influence for him to help him go further, faster, and over the course of the long haul. Some of the real work of good and justice is going to happen off camera now, when everyone else who is pilfering tragedy for their own platform pulls away. Church, where will we be? And what will we be doing? Let us not grow weary. And part of us not growing weary is then, as we see kind of the helpers and get behind the helpers that are doing the work of justice, also understanding that we have something to offer. Scripture is ripe with moments where God is calling individuals or church bodies to be about the work of justice, and the individuals, the church communities are kind of self-disqualifying, right? Moses and his excuses, Gideon's focusing on his numbers, in the feeding of the 5,000, the disciples are going like, there's a dude that's got 5 loaves and 2 fish. What can you do with this? And what Scripture perpetually reminds us of is that when people of God offer their gifts, their passions, their story to kingdom resource, that in God's economy, God does extraordinary things with our ordinary. And we spend a lot of time in the work, particularly of justice, at least I have anyway, of finding ways to self-disqualify, right? I'm about the whitest white guy of white guys. Maybe I don't have anything to offer in this conversation about justice. That's a lie I had to take before God. That rather to say, God, what would you do with my voice, my gifts, my passions? My friend Nikki Lerner says, God has given you everything you need today to do the thing that God has called you to do. And if we're going to break down individual and interpersonal and institutional strongholds, there's some of those that come really naturally to you. There's gifts and passions that you have that someone else in your church doesn't. And rather than waiting for Pastor Joel or for one person in your church who's got the corner kind of laid out on justice, what if you began to say, God, what do I have to offer this conversation? Maybe you're a nurse who can think about the work of justice in a particular way. Maybe you're a grant writer who knows how to cut through all of the red tape and bureaucracy. Maybe you're a person that can't go protest on the streets during a pandemic because of some underlying health conditions, but you can begin to be an economic engine to someone in your community who's trying to hold things together. Maybe you can't overhaul the entire federal education system, but you can make sure that your local school is equipped and that your presence and proximity to that local school informs how you might create legislation at voting times to bring better thriving to your school or to other schools in your community. May we not just wait to be engaged, but may we begin to see, and this is the Baltimore application here really quick, that we need to see our city as an ecosystem of flourishing where everybody in the city, everyone is doing their part, offering their gifts and passions and story to see the work of good and justice prevail. So let's recap one more time before we go this last point. Galatians 6:9 says, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." The last point I want to offer for our time together today is to keep showing up. So Paul uses an agrarian analogy, sowing and reaping and agriculture and farming, that works really well, I think, for the analogy of working in our cities. Because farming is hard work. It requires persistence to keep digging in the soil when you don't see the immediate gratification of the moment. It means being willing to perpetually get your hands dirty, blood, sweat, and tears as it relates to protecting that soil from varying forms of pestilence. It means constant pivots as the circumstances and environment that you're trying to create change. We have to keep showing up. If I'm honest about the early hopes of what we crafted for the Foundry in terms of vision and mission and strategy, is that we kind of hoped that we could just sort of program our way into flourishing in our community, that we could create enough service projects that people would get it, that we could create enough sermons about race and justice and reconciliation that people would immediately want to go do that. But we have to, and I think this is what my time has shown me over the several years, is that presence over the long haul matters. That it's not enough just to kind of build the plan on the napkin, that we've got to go do the work, be present over the course of time. I had a good friend once who was in New York City, and I said to him, hey, I think my congregation is finally starting to see in 2015 that some of the things we're talking about aren't just these fairy tales that make for sad sermon illustrations. And so what advice would you give us? He said, grab a Snickers. You're going to be here for a while. And I think that is my advice to those of us who have maybe heard these sermons and listened to this series and have been invited and comforted and challenged, is to remember to keep showing up over the course of the long haul. We have this tendency to want easy and quick solutions, when easy and quick solutions are part of what's created systems and structures that have swept things under the rug. The low and slow and hard and long-standing work of seeing God's shalom prevail means that we might be putting things in the soil now that may not even reap a harvest in our lifetime. And so are we willing to reject the instant gratification of just doing things that make us feel good? Are we willing to enter the space of others so that we don't just have ideologies without biographies? Gustavo Gutierrez says, "You say you love the poor. Tell me their names." Do we know the names of people in our community? Do we know people that are shop owners or neighbors that we can begin to enter relational spaces with so that we don't just have ideologies without biographies? Are we willing to continue to show up when it's hard and more disappointing? Here's what I found, and it's a lot like with my own sin. The more that I pay attention to my own sin, the more aware I am of my own sin. And the more that you pay attention to injustice in your community, the more that you're going to see it. And that's going to actually be more heartbreaking and harder to just numb yourself with craft beer and $10 coffees. It isn't going to be a sufficient lift. We have to continue to persist in showing up. I think this begs a question even for us who consider ourselves part of a church in a city. What can we do to stay for as long as we can to be part of the work? Something I know about Baltimore, and I'm sure is true of DC, is that cities can be fairly transient places, especially during pandemics and election cycles, right? So how do we commit ourselves for the heart of a long haul in the context of our city, or even when God might lead us beyond the city? Right? So what that might mean is if God has called you to DC for a year, what would it look like to stay for 2? If God has brought you to DC for a certain timeline, to begin to offer God that trajectory in that story and say, God, are you calling me to be part of the solution here longer? Or God, if I know you're taking me away at the end of a course of time, how can where I'm going next be a work that advances and builds on the work of justice that I've thought about and experienced because of my time here? That I might continue to lean in a particular way, in a particular space. What would it look like if you said, hey, you know what? Here was the plan and here was the trajectory for how we were going to engage the city, and then we were going to move out and do our own thing. And whether how do you offer God that timeline and say, God, this timeline is yours. Do the work of justice in me and help me be present in and around my community for the long haul. Right? And so may we be a people who are willing to enter the space, not just to create short-term relief in the face of crisis, but to be a set-apart people who continue to show up and show out in and around our communities over the course of seeing the slow work, the slow arc of justice come to bear, trusting that he who began the good work will be faithful to complete it. May we start with our own heart. May we look around and find the helpers. May we commit to offer what we have. And may we continue to do that with grace and truth over the course of time.